It's just not for the dignitaries. It's not just for those that have means. It's open to everybody.
All kinds of people feel they belong here enough to have some of their most intimate rituals performed in this place.
This City Hall to me symbolizes more than anything else. Hopefulness, optimism, its rebirth, the phoenix that arises from fire and destruction.
City Hall is a beautiful building, but it's really also a lens through which to view San Francisco's social and political history.
For some, it's been that symbol of the palace for the people, the symbol of democracy. But for others, it's been a symbol of oppression. It's been a symbol of exclusion.
This is the symbol of the government of the city. The symbol is what you make it to be.
Major funding for the People's Palace is provided by AT&T, PG&E, Twitter, and Wells Fargo Bank. Additional funding provided by the contributors to the San Francisco City Hall Centennial Fund.
For 100 years, under this noble dome, the events that have irreversibly shaped this city have unfolded. Its drama, tragedies, and triumphs. Today, City Hall seems like a permanent fixture on the skyline, but the icon we take for granted now nearly never got built. Because a century ago, its predecessor had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with government. The 1906 earthquake killed thousands and left even more homeless. But its most notorious casualty was City Hall. Allegedly built to withstand any calamity, it didn't even survive the first moments of the quake.
And that early City Hall actually took, I think, 27 years to build. It had a 400% cost overrun. After an inglorious life of only 7 years, it ignominiously collapsed completely in the 1906 quake.
One historian said that it seemed to have been constructed largely of thinly varnished graft.
City Hall now literally stood for corruption. In a series of graft trials, then Mayor Eugene Schmitz and the entire Board of Supervisors were run out of office, and infamous influence peddler Abraham Roof was jailed.
The ruins of the old City Hall became a symbol of the failures of the city, the corruption of city politics, and the longer the ruins were there, the more seemed to cast a pall over the city.
San Franciscans, weary and skeptical, rejected each effort to rebuild a city center. It would take a charismatic new mayor, James P. Rolfe, Jr., to change their minds.
He was called Sunny Jim because of his unfailingly genial and happy temperament. He was a big, florid-faced, good-looking man who always wore beautiful suits, invariably had an elegant boutonniere in his buttonhole. He was just sort of a larger-than-life, glad-handing figure.
He is part of the progressive movement. He's part of this wing that wants to clean up the government, bring good government back to San Francisco, and he has a vision of a whole civic center and a city hall.
Rolfe was swept into office in 1911 on a tide of optimism and a series of campaign promises to rebuild the city's infrastructure and a brand new city hall. But all of this hinged on another daring plan: to invite the world to San Francisco for an international exposition celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal.
Rolfe used the Panama Pacific International Exposition, the PPIE, as the economic engine to rebuild the whole city, and the Civic Center was a counterpart to the fairgrounds up in the Marina District.
Rolfe called for a special election to vote on an $8.8 million bond issue to acquire the land in the Civic Center and construct a $4 million city hall. The new mayor then did what he did best.
He was a whirlwind. He went throughout the city selling this bond issue, and it passed with more than 90% of yes votes. Just an amazing demonstration of Rolfe's ability to sell a project to the voters.
Rolf announced an architectural competition for the design of the new City Hall. Even though entrants had barely 2 months to complete their drawings, the city received 73 submissions.
The architectural world was stunned when the firm that was chosen was virtually unknown. John Bakewell and Arthur Brown, these two architects whose only significant work hitherto had been the Berkeley City Hall.
Arthur Brown Jr. and John Bakewell had studied together at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and their submission took full advantage of the Beaux-Arts tradition, an eclectic mixture of classical and Renaissance styles. At the center of their design was a monumental dome, inspired by the Dome of the Invalides in Paris.
What Bakewell and Brown offered was a very efficient office building on the ends and a spectacular ceremonial core with the rotunda and the dome at the center. Every office was delineated, every size calculated. It looked to the jurors as if they could practically use those plans and immediately build the building.
The city now had the momentum. They had the money, a location, and a magnificent design. But what they faced was a deadline. The PPIE opening was less than 3 years away. On April 5, 1913, Mayor Rolf and city dignitaries broke ground for the new City Hall. Teams of horses delivered over 7,000 tons of steel, and the 4-story building dominated the skyline with its massive dome. As the gray Sierra granite exterior rose into place, Arthur Brown's concern turned to the interior, and most importantly, how light would permeate the massive stone structure.
He's very conscious of how he's going to light this building, and the light courts, of course, are one of the main features. The rotunda also brings in light from the top, because you have those clear-story windows in the drum of the dome that bring light down into the center of the building.
For the building's detailed ornamentation, Arthur Brown chose a talented friend from the École des Beaux-Arts, Jean-Louis Bourgeois.
Bourgeois was brought to San Francisco by Brown in 1912 as soon as they won the City Hall competition. And he developed the ornamental language for the building. You'll see the intertwined SFs, for example, through the building that later got picked up by a certain baseball team.
As was typical of civic buildings of the period, it was important that Bourgeois' work also tell a story.
At City Hall, the story has to be about the rising of the city, the recovery of the city from the earthquake and fire. And so you'll see a lot of the ornament in the building discussing the idea of strength through fire.
All of this detailed work required the skills of an army of craftsmen.
Fortunately, because they were building the Panama Pacific International Exposition, there were thousands of craftsmen from all over the world. This allowed Bakewell and Brown to coordinate the efforts of thousands of these craftspeople and bring their talents to bear on San Francisco City Hall.
One of those craftsmen was called upon to create the signature sculptures, most recognized by visitors to City Hall.
Henri Cronier was a French sculptor. He executed the pedamental sculpture and the fine art sculpture of the building. Cronier was very much the grand artiste.
He had a studio a few blocks away where he actually worked on the models and molds for City Hall.
Cronier brought live nude models to his studio, surrounded for privacy by a wooden fence.
One of the great sports was to figure out when the models were going to be working and find a convenient knothole to watch them work.
In a unique design twist, the grand staircase that rises from the ground floor of the rotunda leads not to the mayor's office, but to the Board of Supervisors. Whether this was a conscious jab at the power of mayors after the graft trials or pragmatic design, the grandeur of the oak-paneled chamber is unsurpassed.
Most people who visit the Board of Supervisors chambers look up and they think the ceiling is also out of wood. It is not. It is a cast plaster ceiling that has all been color enhanced to show the detail.
Though not quite complete, the doors to City Hall opened as Rolfe promised on December 28, 1915. And it proved to be just the tonic the city needed to progress beyond the natural and political disasters of the previous decade.
The building was received rapturously as soon as it opened. The critics wrote, "We have achieved this lavish, magnificent structure, and this proves that San Francisco knows how to do things in this over-the-top, magnificent, opulent way."
Taking advantage of the vast spaces created by the earthquake and fire, City Hall became the center of an entire civic center complex, one of the nation's best examples of the City Beautiful movement.
Rolfe probably talked about building City Hall to the end of his days. He was very proud that they built it without a hint of graft, and he thinks it's one of the most magnificent municipal buildings in the United States.
The accomplishments of Rolfe's first administration endeared him to voters, so much so that he continued to be elected term after term for an unparalleled 19 years. He only left to become the governor of California. As he departed for Sacramento, he instructed workers to leave one final mark on the building he so dearly loved. Above the massive clock, he had inscribed James Rolfe Jr., Mayor, 1912-1931. The world would soon beat a path to San Francisco's new front door. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew into Crissy Field and was met with a grand parade up Market Street ending at City Hall, a tradition that would mark every civic parade for decades to come. When President Warren Harding died in San Francisco, his funeral cortege passed City Hall as if it were the capital. In 1934, San Francisco would gain national attention as the battleground for the strike that threatened to shut down commerce up and down the West Coast. Mayor Angelo Rossi tried his best to bring the two sides together at City Hall.
He brought together union leaders from the Longshoremen's Union, from the Teamsters Union, and representatives of the waterfront employers. And they produced an agreement on June 16th. Unfortunately, it didn't include what the longshoremen wanted most, which was a union hiring hall with a union dispatcher, and they rejected it.
In the end, City Hall was unable to resolve what became the most violent of all of San Francisco's 20th century strikes. It wouldn't be the last time the people would bring their grievances to City Hall.
City Hall itself has witnessed a number of fascinating eruptions of people's power. One of the more intriguing and amusing of those took place in 1947 after Mayor Roger Lapham ill-advisedly decided that he wanted to get rid of the cable cars. And the movement was led by a group basically of society ladies. They actually organized and stormed up the steps of City Hall, which gave rise to an immortal quote in which someone said, "Nothing sends fear into the heart of the mayor like a bunch of ladies in dresses and handbags storming up the stairs of City Hall."
The grand staircase would become the site of a much less genteel protest. In 1960, the country was still under the pall of McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee. The committee announced it was coming to San Francisco City Hall to hold one of its controversial hearings, and it became a flashpoint for a group of students and others who'd grown weary of HUAC's abuses.
In 1960, here in City Hall, the old left and this emerging new left came together to protest against what HUAC was doing. The police were there in force, and they ultimately resorted to using fire hoses to wash the protesters down the steps from the supervisor's chamber to the main level of City Hall, all of which was captured on television.
My mother's parting words to us when we left for the demonstration was, "Please don't get arrested." So of course I got arrested. I don't know if you know what a fire hose is like, but it's not like your backyard garden hose. You know, it's a high pressure hose. And we were washed down the stairs with these hoses, and the screaming and shouting, and people were terrified. And then all around the rotunda, all around these balconies, people who worked at City Hall were watching the demonstrators. So the sound reverberated through the halls, through these beautiful halls. It was a seminal thing for those of us who were involved. We came up against police power in a way that we never had before.
It wasn't an enormous protest by historical standards, but there's absolutely a connection between the HUAC protests and the far more famous free speech movement that happened in Berkeley 4 years later.
1964. Months before students in Berkeley made headlines, it was here in Civic Center Plaza that they first got attention. Thousands gathered to protest the anti-civil rights platform of the Republican Party, meeting at the Cow Palace for their nominating convention.
I think it really, to me, launched the real free speech movement because many of the people who were here in front of City Hall were also people on Sproul Plaza. Dr. Goodland, my boss from the Sun Reporter, wanted me down here to cover the protest, to let people know that they may be here at the Cow Palace, but down here at the heart of the city, there were people speaking out for equality.
Physician, civil rights maverick, and publisher, Dr. Carlton Goodlett was to become one of the city's most influential and outspoken community leaders. In 1999, 2 blocks of Polk Street along Civic Center Plaza were renamed in his honor, and today, 1 Carlton B. Goodlett Place is the official address of City Hall. The political winds were changing in San Francisco. The Summer of Love, the youth movement, and the influx of new groups into the city throughout the 60s and 70s would soon have a major impact on the politics of City Hall. For most of its history, the Board of Supervisors was made up largely of the most privileged of San Franciscans. But in 1977, a ballot proposition passed to elect supervisors by neighborhood rather than citywide. It would change the course of the city's history in more ways than one.
That election produced a significant change in the composition of the board. For the first time, for example, there was an openly gay small business owner. There was a self-described unwed mother. There was a firefighter. There was the first African-American woman. The kinds of people who hadn't been serving on the Board of Supervisors in the previous 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years were now being elected to the board.
The makeup of the new board led to a power shift, and suddenly issues like height limits for downtown skyscrapers and whether or not to allow cars to drive downtown were on the agenda.
The meetings could be quite fractious, as a matter of fact, and they could go on to the early hours. We could recess for dinner, come back, and debate various matters. My need was to be able to have people come in and sit down and solve problems together.
Progressive Mayor George Moscone seemed to handle all the political theater with humor and savvy. Then, on November 27, 1978, former Supervisor Dan White, angry that Moscone had refused to reappoint him to his seat on the board, brought a gun in through a basement window and shot and killed both the mayor and Supervisor Harvey Milk.
I heard the door slam. I heard the shots. I came out, I smelt the cordite, and no one was around. Everyone had disappeared. So I found Harvey's office and opened the door, and he was on his stomach, and I put my finger trying to get a pulse through a bullet hole in his wrist.
I didn't know the mayor was dead at the time. It seems unbelievable to me. Dianne Feinstein, being president of the Board of Supervisors, came out finally with some word of what had happened.
In the turbulent hours after the assassinations, San Franciscans gathered outside City Hall to express their grief.
Everybody was here. It wasn't just gay people. It was people like me and my mother, you know. We were horrified, and people were holding candles, and nobody even asked. People just came here.
And it's a horrible scar in City Hall. It just seems like an ugly place when that happens.
In the months that followed, Dan White was tried, but was found guilty not of first-degree murder, but the lesser charge of manslaughter. Outraged San Franciscans stormed the streets around City Hall, in a night of rioting and mayhem.
You saw rocks coming through the windows. Tear gas had to be used. What it felt like was terrible because you saw things coming apart.
While the city reeled and tried to put the tragedies behind it, no one seemed to notice that its crown jewel, City Hall, was slipping into disrepair.
Over the decades, particularly the 60s and 70s and 80s, much of the news about the building was negative. The building became more and more degraded through neglect, and people stopped caring about it.
It was a horrible place for such a spectacular building. You walked in the skylights in the North Light Court and the South Light Court had been covered over, and they had been divided into little squirrel cages for people who worked here at City Hall. And so it was just a dreadful place.
The 1989 Loma Prieta quake caused heavy damage to cities and towns all over Northern California. While City Hall fared better than its notorious predecessor, it took a major hit.
The dome and drum itself, it rotated 8 inches out of alignment, so it was spinning like a top. Had the earthquake lasted longer, it might have spun right off the building.
As the city once again picked itself up from disaster, the voters approved a $183 million bond issue to seismically upgrade the civic landmark. Plans were drawn up, and in 1995, renovation began. Before the incoming mayor, Willie Brown, even took the oath of office, he visited project manager Tony Irons.
He came and asked me to show him the blueprints and tell him what I was doing. And so I brought out a roll of blueprints, and he took them and said, "I want you to throw these in a trash can."
When I met Tony Irons, I was blown away that what he had been charged with doing at City Hall and what he had been authorized to do was inconsistent with what this grand building needed to be.
He said, "You do what is necessary, everything necessary to completely renovate this building, and I will find all the money."
The first priority was seismic safety. To move more fluidly in future quakes, the entire structure was placed on a flexible foundation.
The building doesn't touch the ground. All of the columns of the building sit on a rubber and steel base isolator, and then creating a moat all the way around the building so it could move, I believe, 27 inches in any direction in the greatest expected earthquake.
One of the more contentious debates centered on how to refinish the exterior of the dome, whether to leave the decades-old copper-green patina or return it to its 1915 origins, a dark lead with gilded accents. A lead-free substitute was finally agreed on, but gilding was not in the budget. One day, a local architect happened to be complaining to Mayor Brown about a city code that required him to add outdoor artwork to his new building. It gave Brown an idea.
He said, "Can you see the dome of City Hall from that building?" He said, "Of course I can." He had no idea why I was asking that. I said, "Suppose I could get planning to accept the outside of your art would be on the dome at City Hall. You're about to spend the money for gold leaf in the dome." He said, "You gotta be kidding." I said, "No." He said, "Does the law allow that?" I said, "I'm the law." And of course, his guy immediately agreed to it. I wanted this City Hall, in light of the quake, to recapture the magic that must have driven the decision makers in 1915.
3 years and $300 million later, City Hall reopened on January 5th, 1999.
Join me to visit your new home.
San Franciscans turned out to see their re-gilded palace.
I remember the day it opened. There were thousands of people in Civic Center Plaza, and the doors opened to them, and it was such a delight. It was beautiful.
The restoration restored the architectural form of the building, but it also restored the people's love for the building. And as they began to use the building, it became more and more the focus, the center of civic life in the city as it was intended to be.
To have this building sitting here in this civic center, it gives people pride. Every day we have something happening on the steps outside because people want to get their message out. It's a monument that is open to everybody in all its beauty.
Couples have been getting married in City Hall for decades, including celebrity couple Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe in 1954. But in 2004, then newly elected Mayor Gavin Newsom once again thrust San Francisco City Hall into the national consciousness. On February 12th, Newsom directed the clerk's office downstairs to start issuing same-sex marriage licenses. 4,000 couples joyously flocked to City Hall before the courts intervened. It would take more than a decade to resolve.
It was absolutely appropriate that San Francisco became the first American city to have same-sex marriages and host them at City Hall, because San Francisco has always perceived itself as a maverick place.
I think the gay marriage movement happening here, it's just such a wonderful moment after all the things that have happened along the way.
I get very emotional about just walking into this building, the People's Palace. What a wonderful place.
But it's a lovely phrase that Sonny Jim coined. These are buildings that ultimately serve the people and exist for the people.
You know, this is a wonderful, beautiful building, but what fills the building and what people do to solve problems is really important.
San Francisco City Hall symbolizes the ultimate in a democracy. It is, in fact, a people's palace.
Major funding for the People's Palace is provided by AT&T, PG&E, Twitter, and Wells Fargo Bank. Additional funding provided by the contributors to the San Francisco City Hall Centennial Fund.